When I first saw the ranch, it didn't look like much. A stretch of rugged pasture, dotted with old oak trees and bisected by a gravel road that wound up from the main highway, splitting off into a neat, perfectly paved private street leading into the brand-new HOA subdivision across the property line. There was an old barn leaning like it was tired of standing, a small farmhouse in need of paint, and a few rusting cattle gates that hadn't swung open for years. Most folks would have driven right past without a second glance. But I saw potential. For years, I had dreamed of owning land, real land, a place where I could breathe fresh air, watch the sunrise without a neighbor's fence blocking the horizon, and build the kind of life that doesn't come with monthly dues or a list of rules about what color your mailbox has to be. When the opportunity came up to buy this ranch, just outside the creeping reach of the homeowners association next door, I jumped on it. The real estate agent had chuckled when she told me about the HOA. They'd built a new development only 5 years earlier, full of shiny houses that looked as though they were copied and pasted from the same blueprint. Perfectly matching lawns, identical garden gnomes, holiday decorations that followed a strict schedule. Everything managed by a board that took itself far too seriously. The only thing out of their control was the private gravel road cutting through my ranch, the same one they used daily to enter their pristine neighborhood. The previous owner had let them use it without fuss, strictly verbal, never written. He'd been elderly, more interested in peace than paperwork. But when he passed, everything changed. I hadn't owned the ranch more than a week before the whispers began. Or rather, not whispers, complaints. The HOA president herself, a woman whose stare was as sharp as the heels she stomped around in, approached me with a clipboard clutched in her hand like a weapon. She made it clear that they expected business as usual. They expected access to continue. They expected compliance. What they did not expect was someone who wasn't afraid to say no. From the moment she realized the ranch had slipped into new hands, she seemed personally offended that I dared live outside their influence. She inspected my house from the road, taking notes like a property inspector. She slowed her car to glare every time she passed. And rumor had it, she'd already tried to call the county about enforcing HOA bylaws on me. Bylaws that had absolutely no jurisdiction here. It wasn't just annoyance I felt from her. It was hostility, as though my mere existence outside their authority was some kind of threat to the strict order she ruled. I kept to myself at first, focusing on renovations and planning for livestock once the fencing was repaired. Workers came and went, hauling out old debris and hauling in supplies. That alone seemed to irritate the HOA neighbors. The trucks made dust clouds on the gravel road, and the sound of construction carried farther than expected. While I worked, I could sometimes hear grumbling voices from the other side of the fence, or see lawn-clad residents peering through binoculars, as if my ranch were some sort of forbidden spectacle. The first formal complaint letter arrived taped to my mailbox on day 10. It listed violations, such as visible construction materials, dirt on the road, and noise outside of HOA-regulated hours. The words property value risk appeared twice in bold. I knew instantly who had written it. Still, I remained polite. I tossed the letter into a drawer, finished my work, and kept my distance. But things escalated quickly. On a windy afternoon, one of my contractors approached to tell me that a woman from the subdivision had stormed onto the property, screaming that we were destroying community land. He pointed toward the fence line where she'd been waving her arms like a furious conductor, issuing orders no one intended to follow. When she didn't get her way, she stormed off again in a rage, but not before snapping photos of everything she could. The next day, the county sheriff showed up, looking embarrassed. He apologized for disturbing me and explained that someone had reported illegal construction and animal neglect, despite the fact that there were no animals yet and all permits were accounted for. He took a quick look around confirmed everything was in order, and assured me he wouldn't be back unless the complaints turned malicious. Malicious already felt like an understatement. From then on, the HOA president and her loyal followers appeared regularly at the end of the gravel road, staring at every vehicle that used it. They flagged down delivery drivers, claiming the road was private and that packages needed to be rerouted. They even attempted to block access one morning by parking 2 SUVs in the driveway's path, insisting they were protecting neighborhood safety. It took only a single call to the sheriff to get them moved, but their glares that day carried a message. They weren't finished. I began digging into property records. If they wanted to challenge me, I wanted to know exactly where I stood. What I found surprised even me. Not only was the road part of my property, but there was no written easement guaranteeing the HOA access. Their entire neighborhood's entry road, their only entry road, legally belonged to me. They had no alternate outlet to the highway. Without permission, they were trespassing every single day. Apparently, the previous owner had been too kind, or too tired, to enforce what was his. But the moment I realized the power they assumed they had was actually mine, I knew confrontation was inevitable. I still didn't intend to be unreasonable. If they wanted continued access, we could negotiate a road maintenance agreement. A fair arrangement where they contributed financially to the dust control and repairs they benefited from. A win-win scenario. But when I invited the HOA president to discuss terms, she didn't show up alone. She brought 2 board members, stacks of paperwork, and a smug attitude dripping with superiority. She didn't ask. She demanded. She insisted I sign over permanent access rights with no compensation and no future ability to revoke the agreement. She claimed it was only proper. The implied message, submit to HOA control, even though I wasn't part of them. I stared down at the documents she slid toward me, all formatted to appear as though compliance was merely a formality. But I recognized a trap when I saw one. Signing would be handing them control. Forever. When I declined, the president's pleasant mask cracked. She hissed threats of legal action and county involvement. She called me selfish, reckless, and dangerous to the community. She made it clear she would make my life miserable until I complied. But she underestimated just how stubborn a ranch owner could be, especially one who bought this land specifically to avoid people like her. As they drove away, I knew a line had been drawn. There would be no civility, no compromise. Not with someone who believed control was her entitlement. If they wanted war, I owned the battlefield, and the only road they could use. For now, I waited, letting them make the next move, knowing full well that whatever they tried would only give me more justification for the final decision building in the back of my mind. The decision to close the road, to cut off their access, to show them what it really meant to mess with someone who didn't answer to their rules. The storm was coming, and they didn't even know they were standing directly in its path. The first true retaliation came quietly. No shouting, no confrontation, just a slow, creeping sabotage that seemed designed to torment me in small, frustrating ways. Every morning for a week, I found new tire tracks on the pasture near the road, looping like someone had intentionally driven circles under the cover of darkness. Gates that I had left securely chained were mysteriously unlatched in the night, left wide open so that if I had livestock, they would wander straight onto the road. There were nails spread across the gravel like metal confetti, fresh, shiny, and always positioned where my truck tires would roll. One morning, I walked out to discover that every mailbox along the HOA development stood polished and perfect, except mine, which had been smashed inward as though by a baseball bat. It was all petty, yet persistent, and there was zero doubt who orchestrated it. The HOA president wanted me to give in, to surrender quietly, crawl under her thumb, and act like I'd made a mistake by buying land that dared to remain independent from her rules. But the more she pushed, the more determined I became. Instead of giving them what they wanted, I hired a surveying crew. The workers pounded stakes into the soil along the property boundaries, bright orange flags marking where my land ended and where their influence did. When the HOA board members saw those flags fluttering in the breeze, their faces twisted with outrage. They didn't like visual reminders that the land and road they relied on was not theirs. The tension only escalated when construction began on the new fencing I'd ordered. Tall, steel post fencing reinforced with mesh wire. My workers dug new post holes along the boundary, closing off the gaps where HOA residents liked to stroll freely onto my ranch during their organized evening walks. They glared from the sidewalk as if blocked access to my property was somehow a violation against them. Then came the road work. The gravel road needed patching. That much had been true since the day I arrived. Dump trucks began hauling in new stone, and graders scraped the surface to level and drain it properly. The noise echoed across the quiet suburb, rattling windows and upsetting routines. The HOA president appeared at the end of the driveway often, arms folded, broadcasting her displeasure like a radio signal. She complained about dust, truck noise, and temporary detours. A few residents staged an impromptu protest, standing with crossed arms and handmade cardboard signs demanding I stop disrupting the community. But I wasn't disrupting their community. They were trespassing through mine. Despite everything, I still wasn't ready to take the final step, closing the road completely. I wanted to give them every chance to choose cooperation over hostility. They refused. The day the road grader accidentally left a small ridge of gravel blocking one lane of the road, chaos erupted like a hornet's nest had been kicked. Cars honked endlessly. A few drivers attempted to plow over the ridge, getting stuck and spinning dust everywhere. The HOA president, clearly believing she controlled even my workers, marched up and demanded they stop until she approved the repairs. She didn't realize that I had been watching from the fence line. When my workers explained, politely, that she had no authority here, her fury metastasized into something vengeful and dangerous. She stormed straight to the county offices and filed a complaint, claiming I was obstructing emergency access routes and endangering public safety. This time, the sheriff arrived with a representative from the county engineering department. They examined the road carefully, confirmed that all construction permits were valid, and determined there was no legal obstruction. Just routine maintenance the HOA should have been grateful for. The HOA president was not grateful. Her eyes burned with a very clear promise that the feud was no longer about property. It was personal. That evening, as the construction crew left and twilight painted the ranch in fading warmth, I walked the length of the road alone. The breeze carried the scent of dust and hay. The orange flags marking the survey line glowed like little warning beacons, and beyond them, the HOA lights flickered on methodically, each identical house illuminating in perfect, robotic synchronization. They had built a world of uniformity, and I was the unpredictable variable they couldn't control. The next morning, I found a new letter, not taped this time, hammered into a fence post with a nail long enough to make removal a two-handed effort. It was a final warning letter from the HOA board, threatening fines, property seizure, and legal action unless I immediately ceased construction, restored community access privileges, and agreed to abide by their bylaws. It was absurd. An HOA has no authority over private land outside its boundaries, and they knew it. The threats were empty, but the act revealed something much more important. They weren't planning to negotiate. They were planning to eliminate resistance. That night, everything changed. Just past midnight, I heard the crunch of gravel beneath slow-moving tires. I slipped outside quietly and watched from behind the barn as a pickup truck rolled to a stop near the road construction area. Two figures stepped out, their faces hidden by hoodies. and approached the construction equipment. I saw them pour something, sugar, or maybe sand, into the fuel tanks of the machinery. Another person slashed the tires on the grader. They kicked over survey stakes and snapped the fencing wire they could reach. And then, as though proud of their vandalism, they spray-painted a crude message across the new roadbed. The message wasn't clever. It wasn't subtle. It was a declaration of war. They fled before I could record enough evidence to identify them, but not before making their intent loud and clear. If I wouldn't bow to the HOA, they would ruin everything I built. By sunrise, the damage was undeniable. The construction crew stood frustrated and helpless while waiting for new equipment. The sheriff took another report, shaking his head as though exhausted by the ongoing stupidity. Even he suggested, delicately, that a security gate might help prevent further incidents. That idea planted a seed in my mind. I spent the day reviewing files and property maps again. Everything I needed was right there. Legal clarity, ownership rights, land authority. The HOA had pushed every boundary, crossed every line, and destroyed any chance of peaceful coexistence. They had bullied. They had vandalized. They had trespassed. And now, they wanted to force me into submission. They had no idea what they had triggered. As the sun dipped behind the hills and the HOA porch lights flicked on once more like synchronized fireflies, I stood at the gravel road's entrance with a quiet, resolute understanding. They relied on something they did not own, and tomorrow I would take it back. Not as an act of revenge, as a reminder. I didn't need the HOA. The HOA needed me. The time for warnings was over. Tomorrow, the road would close. The morning I closed the road began calm and quiet, the kind of peaceful dawn that reminded me why I had bought the ranch in the first place. Mist hung low over the fields, and sunlight slowly crept over the hillside, painting long stretches of gold across the grass. But beneath that warm serenity, an electric tension buzzed in the air, the sense that today was going to alter everything. I had prepared well. The construction crew had delivered materials the night before: a sturdy metal gate, reinforced fencing, concrete posts, and a locking mechanism designed to withstand both impatience and brute force. While the HOA slept, dreaming of their manicured perfection, I set to work. There was no crowd at first, no witnesses. Only the clang of metal and the dull thud of post-hole diggers broke the calm. Dust puffed upward as I secured the gate's foundation, ensuring it would not budge once locked. The steel gleamed in the early light, a visible symbol of change, one the HOA could not ignore. Every pound of the hammer felt like reclaiming ownership. Every bolt turned was a declaration. This land belonged to me, not to a committee obsessed with uniformity. When the final hinge snapped into place, I stepped back and admired the boundary I should have enforced from the moment I moved in. The gate swung shut with a heavy finality. I locked it. And just like that, the HOA's reliance on my goodwill came to an abrupt end. It didn't take long for the consequences to reveal themselves. The quiet morning routine of the subdivision shattered the moment the first residents approached in their shiny SUVs, expecting their effortless exit to the highway. Their brakes screeched the instant they saw the gate, the irrefutable proof that their unchallenged access had come to a close. Confusion spread quickly. Drivers honked, backed up traffic, and started turning their cars around awkwardly, unsure what to do. Soon, a frustrated line formed all the ether, way back to the first turn of their perfectly paved street. It was only a matter of time before their leader appeared. The HOA president rushed forward like a general whose battalion had been ambushed. Her shoes kicked up gravel as she stomped toward the gate, examining every inch of the structure with disbelief. Her expression twisted into a look that silently screamed outrage. She pounded on the metal as if force alone could reverse the decision. A swarm of residents gathered behind her, nervous, angry, indignant. They stared through the bars as though the ranch had suddenly become a prison, keeping them trapped inside their own community. Except it wasn't a prison. It was simply no longer their shortcut. As time ticked by, the frustrations grew louder. Cars tooted their horns rhythmically, creating a shrill chorus across the land. People gestured wildly at the fence, trying to get my attention as though their demands alone could command obedience. I watched from the porch of the farmhouse, hidden enough that they couldn't see me clearly, but close enough to witness every angry movement. They hadn't expected consequences. They believed the world operated under their rules. Now they were learning otherwise. The HOA president eventually retreated to fetch reinforcements. Not long after, the sheriff's cruiser rolled into view, lights flashing. I walked down slowly to meet him, watching the irritated mob simmer behind him. He had been here enough times to know the dynamic, and his weary expression told me he suspected what had happened even before he asked. I explained everything calmly. The vandalism, the sabotage, the midnight trespassers, the absence of any legal easement granting the HOA access. I presented the documents I had prepared in anticipation. A folder brimming with paperwork, photos, and recorded timestamps. The sheriff nodded as he flipped through the evidence. Everything was clear. Everything was legal. Everything pointed to the simple truth. I had every right to protect what was mine. The HOA president lurked behind him, ready to strike with any objection that would restore her self-appointed authority. But this time, she had no leverage, no paperwork granting her automatic victory. The sheriff delivered the verdict. Without my permission, the HOA would have to find another route in and out of their neighborhood. The shock that rippled through the residents was almost palpable. Their faces fell, their certainty crumbling. Homeowners clutched their keys, frozen in disbelief at the idea of being trapped behind their perfectly maintained fences. But the sheriff wasn't done. He reminded them, sternly, that the previous cooperation they enjoyed was voluntary, that trespassing would no longer be tolerated, that further harassment or sabotage would result in arrests. The HOA president's glare sharpened into something cold and venomous, a silent promise of retribution. I saw the gears turning in her mind, not acceptance, but indignation. She believed herself to be a ruler, and rulers don't accept defeat. They regroup, they retaliate. She would not go quietly. As the sheriff drove away, residents slowly dispersed, returning to their driveways with uncertainty hanging over them like a storm cloud ready to burst. Emergency crews were called to discuss temporary detours. Delivery trucks were rerouted miles out of their way. Panic spread through the community as they realized the full impact. Their independence had been an illusion. They were landlocked by their own arrogance. For the next several hours, the subdivision remained restless. People wandered along the fence line, staring angrily into the distance as though solutions might materialize. Children who once played freely in their cookie-cutter yards now observed their parents' panic and confusion. When night fell, the HOA held an emergency meeting. I couldn't hear their words, but the silhouettes of furious gestures and frantic pacing painted a clear picture. They were desperate for a plan. What they didn't realize was that this wasn't the end of the fight, only the beginning. Over the next few days, attempts to regain control intensified. The HOA's attorney sent official-looking letters filled with legal threats and accusatory statements, each one more dramatic and baseless than the last. They claimed public necessity. They invoked imaginary community rights. They even argued that restricting road access violated suburban peace and welfare standards. All of it flimsy, all of it irrelevant, because the law was on my side. Their anger grew, but so did their helplessness. Commutes were delayed. Deliveries were missed. Guests were told to park elsewhere and walk. The perfectly constructed facade of convenience and superiority was crumbling. Meanwhile, the ranch remained quiet, untouched by the chaos. I fed the horses I had finally brought home. I fixed up the barn. Life grew richer and fuller, while the HOA fell apart piece by piece. But beneath every victory lay a subtle warning. The HOA president was furious beyond measure. She had not yet revealed her final strategy. The destruction she had already caused was just a preview of how far she was willing to go. The closing of the road hadn't broken her. It had awakened something worse: outrage, desperation, and a determination to win back control by any means necessary. Tut knew the dispute was destined to escalate again. Much bigger, much messier, and far more dangerous than a steel gate. Because when people who believe they have power suddenly lose it, they don't surrender, they plot. The first week after the gate went up unfolded like a slow unraveling of everything the HOA thought was untouchable. What began as inconvenience transformed into a full-blown crisis. The subdivision's perfect facade, its tranquility, its order, its curated image of superiority began to fracture. Commutes became unpredictable. Complicated by a crude dirt track, the HOA scraped into a corner of their development, trying to create a makeshift exit through an unkempt patch of county land. Every rainfall turned it to mud. Every passing truck carved deeper ruts. Tow trucks came and went daily, dragging out stuck vehicles like defeated soldiers pulled from a battlefield. Packages piled up in the post office, waiting for someone willing to carry them the long walk around. Service providers refused jobs when they learned they would need to haul equipment. Through a field, residents became prisoners in homes worth far less than they once believed. The HOA president stood center stage in this chaos, refusing to accept defeat. Though the mounting panic showed in the tightness of her expression, her determination only hardened. Each setback fueled her fury, and she launched new strategies with obsessive precision. Her first major attempt came dressed in legal armor. Thick envelopes arrived, stamped with the heavy markings of litigation, accusations and demands packaged between pages that stretched on like a sermon. They alleged that my gate posed a public hazard. They asserted entitlements the law did not support. They claimed decades of usage constituted permanent access rights, but every document collapsed under scrutiny. My attorney dismantled their arguments with quiet efficiency, sending back responses that made their threats look like tantrums scrawled in legal jargon. The HOA suffered defeat after defeat, but pride blinded their leadership from accepting reality. They couldn't accept a world in which their authority stopped at their own fence line. Without legal victory, their tactics turned subversive. The night attacks resumed, louder, bolder, more reckless. A truck attempted to ram the gate, only managing to dent its bumper before retreating into darkness. Someone scattered sharp debris near my driveway again, costing me 2 tires. Spray paint messages returned, splashed across the fence with a venom that dripped down the wood like poison. Every morning revealed new acts of desperation, but I refused to react in anger. I documented everything. I installed motion-activated lights and cameras. My dogs, rescued mutts who had quickly learned to watch over the ranch, patrolled at night, their barks sending interlopers running. The more the HOA tried to force submission, the more they exposed their ugliness. And word was spreading. People outside the community began to hear about what was happening. Contractors traded stories at supply yards. Locals at diners gossiped, shaking their heads at the entitlement festering in that neatly trimmed neighborhood. Some residents began questioning their leadership, quietly, cautiously, as fear of retaliation lingered. Cracks were forming not just in their routines, but in their loyalty. Still, the HOA president refused to allow dissent. She held meeting after meeting, rallying the faithful. Her message became more unhinged with each passing day, that I was a danger, an aggressor, a monster trying to destroy their homes and families. The irony gnawed at me, that the people causing the chaos were the ones claiming to be under attack. In the midst of all this, a new escalation took shape, subtle at first, then rapidly spiraling. Strange entities began appearing near my ranch, inspectors supposedly responding to anonymous calls. They cited imaginary zoning violations and livestock concerns. Code enforcement officers came looking for non-existent hazards. Even animal control arrived one morning, responding to a false claim that my dogs were starving and vicious. Every visit wasted time and stalled progress. Every accusation chipped away at patience, but none of those compared to what came next. One late afternoon, as clouds rolled low and the ranch fell under a storm's looming shadow, I noticed cars trickling into the field just beyond the property line. At first, it seemed like the HOA was holding yet another meeting, but as hours passed, the gathering grew. Dozens, then 100 people all clustered near the fence, staring toward my land with a strange, expectant energy. Their cars lined the pavement like a blockade. Then, lights began to flicker on, portable floodlights rigged to generators. The once quiet field transformed into a buzzing, electrified encampment. It didn't take long to understand. This wasn't a meeting. It was an operation. Workers, not professionals but residents wielding tools they barely understood, charged toward the fence. Some held bolt cutters. Others carried ropes. A few dragged boards or metal bars. They were preparing to tear the fence down, to force access, to reclaim what they believed was theirs by sheer will. The HOA president stood at the front, arms raised like a commander signaling her troops. She was prepared to break the law openly, inciting a mob to rip down barriers the courts had upheld. Her desperation had turned to a reckless determination to win by destruction, if not by right. The realization that things were spiraling beyond vandalism hit me like cold rain. This was no longer about inconvenience. It was about control at any cost. I grabbed my phone with urgency, dialing the sheriff as thunder rumbled overhead. He listened, voice tense, and promised to arrive as fast as he could. But the field was wide, and darkness was falling fast. The mob reached the fence before help did. They pulled, they pried, they hacked. The metallic screech of warping steel rang out across the ranch like a battle cry. Screws snapped and wires twisted. The fence groaned under the force, and then, crack. A section collapsed. Voices erupted in a wave of triumph. They surged forward, boots stomping across ground they had no right to enter. Feet trampled the boundary that had once felt firm and secure. Their trespass was no longer secret and cowardly. It was brazen, public, mob-fueled lawlessness. I knew confrontation was fruitless. The sheer number of them made any resistance dangerous and foolish. So I monitored from a safe distance, recording everything. Every face, every action, every person who crossed onto my land believing might made right. The sheriff's vehicles eventually barreled down the dirt path, lights flashing bright against the churning storm sky. People scattered like sheep spooked by a predator. Some dashed back into the neighborhood. Others hid in the shadows of trees or behind fences, hoping anonymity would erase their involvement. The HOA president didn't run. She stood stiffly near the fallen fence section, chest heaving with fury and fear. Her defiance radiated even then, as officers demanded explanations. Sirens echoed. Voices rose. The storm finally broke overhead, rain unleashing in sudden torrents, drenching the scene in chaos. By the time the sheriff's team began securing the area, the damage was clear. The line had been crossed, not metaphorically, but physically. The HOA had forced their way into a conflict that could no longer be settled quietly or politely. They had escalated the feud to a level where the law would need to step in decisively. But something else became clear, too. As I watched the HOA president glare at me across the muddy field, her drenched hair plastered to her face, eyes burning with hatred, she was not sorry. She was not done. She would lose everything before she admitted defeat. The storm raged as midnight approached, wind howling against the battered fence, and beneath that chaos, a sobering truth settled in. The battle had reached its breaking point, and what came next would not just change access or convenience. It would change lives. The days following the storm marked a shift that neither I nor the HOA could escape. The breach of the fence wasn't just an act of vandalism, it was the moment the battle crossed into territory where the law could no longer ignore the situation. The sheriff's department responded forcefully, launching investigations and interviewing witnesses. Videos circulated, mine, and footage pulled from security cameras across the community. The HOA president's control began to crumble. Residents who once praised her leadership now viewed her with suspicion. Many had joined the fence attack not out of loyalty, but out of fear of questioning her authority. They had wanted their lives back, the convenience of their former access. But now, they saw clearly who had dragged them into a disaster that threatened property values, reputations, and even legal consequences. Subpoenas arrived like unwelcome mail. Officers quietly escorted key participants from their pristine homes to answer for property destruction and trespassing. News outlets caught wind of the conflict. Stories buzzed online about a homeowners association gone rogue. Commentary channels debated the morality of entitlement versus landowner rights. The HOA president had spent weeks declaring herself the defender of order. Now everyone saw her as the architect of chaos. The board called an emergency meeting, not to rally action this time, but to salvage what remained of their credibility. Residents arrived tense and divided, some still fuming, others ashamed. They argued among themselves, the unity they once held splintering into factions. The leadership who once strutted confidently through perfectly mowed lawns now avoided open streets, weary of being confronted by neighbors demanding answers. For the first time since moving to the ranch, I felt the tide turning solidly in my favor. But the true reckoning hadn't come yet. It arrived when the county made its decision. Officials reviewed every recorded incident, every claim, every page of property maps and code statutes. They saw the pattern: illegal harassment, false reports weaponized against me, coordinated trespassing, and an attempt to force access. Without legal right, the county issued a cease and desist order against the HOA. Any further attempt to access my land or intimidate me would result in severe fines and potential arrests. The sheriff confirmed a patrol rotation would monitor the border until tensions cooled. Then came the blow that dropped the HOA president to her figurative knees. The county approved a request, submitted months earlier by the previous landowner, to officially revoke the verbal easement the HOA had abused for years. They lost all remaining grounds to dispute the closure. Their only legal option was to construct a new public entrance, one that did not involve my land. That meant months of construction, negotiations with the county, and costs that would drain the HOA's treasury faster than fines ever could. The perfect suburb, built on convenience, now faced the consequences of arrogance. A vote was held within the community, one that shook the HOA at its foundation. Residents chose to remove the president from power. She didn't step down gracefully. Reports circulated that she screamed accusations at the crowd, calling them traitors for abandoning her. But her reign ended in that moment. The iron grip she held shattered into resentment and embarrassment. She wasn't done causing trouble, but she no longer commanded an army. In the weeks that followed, Progress quietly replaced chaos. Contractors hired by the newly humbled HOA began construction on a separate road. The triangular patch of land once ignored was surveyed and scraped into shape. The community begrudgingly adapted to its temporary inconveniences, accepting responsibility they once tried to force onto me. My fence was repaired stronger than before. Barbed wire lined the top edge, not as a threat, but as a final reminder. Boundaries matter. Neighbors who once glared at me now avoided eye contact entirely. Some offered awkward waves from afar, timid apologies expressed through body language alone. A few even mailed written notes acknowledging how wrong things had gotten. I didn't need their praises, just their respect and their distance. News coverage died down as life normalized again. The HOA's drama became a cautionary tale, a warning for other communities intoxicated by power. As for the former HOA president, she vanished from the public eye for a while. Rumor had it she faced civil suits from her own neighbors and a pending criminal case for her role in the fence incident. Some whispered she was considering selling her house and leaving the state entirely to escape the humiliation. Her empire of rules and regulations had collapsed into a single truth. Power means nothing outside the bounds of the land you control, and she controlled nothing beyond her front door. One evening, months later, I walked the length of the new fence as the final rays of daylight stretched across the pasture. The horses grazed quietly, the barn lights glowed warm, and the crisp air carried the scent of wildflowers growing in the untouched field beyond. Peace had returned, not because the fight ended easily, but because I stood my ground. I reached the gate and leaned on it for a moment, a piece of steel that symbolized more than just property rights. It represented independence. It represented the refusal to be bullied. It represented the clear message that land ownership doesn't come with submission to someone else's arbitrary control. Beyond the fence, the subdivision appeared as it always had. Rows of perfect homes, identical but for the people inside. But the illusion of authority that once radiated from that place was gone. I had kept my dream intact. Not 1 inch ceded. As I turned back toward the farmhouse, dusk settling softly around the ranch, a thought lingered calmly in my mind. They tried to rule over something that was never theirs. And when entitlement clashed with ownership, ownership won.